Here's the story of an enigmatic vegan nerd who is on a simple mission to summarize the entire history of humanity in 400 pages. His book, Sapiens, came out of nowhere in 2014 and blew up. 23 million copies sold and translated into 65 languages. If you know people who only read 1 or 2 books a year, there is a good chance that one of those books is Sapiens. And if you are surprised that a book about Homo sapiens could be on the New York Times bestseller list for 182 weeks, then I have even more surprises in store for you. The author, Yuval Noah Harari, has become something of a prophetic figure, invited to spread the good word to Google engineers, as well as having his own YouTube channel with over 500,000 subscribers. He lives in seclusion with his husband in the suburbs of Tel Aviv, regularly goes on 10-day silent meditation retreats, and he captivates the world's most influential leaders. In 2018, he spoke at the Davos Forum in between Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. At another conference, we learned that his speaking fee was double that of Donald Trump, got paid a cool $150,000. This is a guy who doesn't have a smartphone and has never heard of Call of Duty, but who gets to give advice to Mark Zuckerberg. Bill Gates lists Sapiens as one of his 10 favorite books, and he's not the only one.
The other book that I really enjoyed, a book by an Israeli author, Yuval Harari, called Sapiens.
It's basically a Silicon Valley cliché at this point. Talk to anyone who works in tech, and chances are pretty good they recommend you a copy of Sapiens. Some guy even launched a parody site that sells Silicon Valley investor starter kits. The kits cost between $500 and $1,000, and along with a classic Patagonia fleece vest, the starter pack contains a copy of Sapiens. On Harari's website, there is an endless list of leaders he has met and debated with. But here's the problem. Not everyone likes Harari. He may have a PhD from Harvard, but many of his scientist colleagues can't stand him. You can find dozens of articles that scrutinize his books line by line, with some extremely harsh conclusions. One anthropologist concludes that we should not judge Sapiens as a serious contribution to knowledge, but as infotainment. A publishing event to titillate its readers by wild intellectual ride across the landscape of history, dotted with sensational displays of speculation and ending with blood-curdling predictions about human destiny. By this criteria, it is the most successful book. And that's not all. One neuroscientist went so far as to call Harari a fraud and a science populist, comparing him to Jordan Peterson. These criticisms were made by experts and backed by many in the scientific community. So how did a reclusive academic who writes about such dry topics become both an advisor to the world's elite and a popular author on bestseller lists around the world? For the biggest historical bestseller of all time, there are some real problems with Sapiens' story. Harari's main idea is that the agricultural revolution was not as beneficial to humankind as people think. For him, it was history's biggest fraud. By giving up hunting and becoming sedentary, humans were drawn into a cycle of overdevelopment and war. He presents this as a very provocative idea, but when you think about it, it's not really that. It's actually trendy these days to want to return to a hunter-gatherer mentality. You only have to look at the success of shows like Survivor, Joe Rogan's bow hunting hobby, or the incredible popularity of post-apocalyptic franchises that portray the collapse of modern society. Another key idea of Sapiens is that humankind managed to climb to the top of the food chain because, unlike other animals, humans are able to collaborate with each other on a very large scale. And what allows us to collaborate and dominate others is that humans are masters at creating shared fictions. The state, money, corporations. The problem is that what Harari calls fictions, sociologists call social constructs, and they've been writing about it for decades in a much deeper way than Harari. So it turns out that what Harari presents as revolutionary ideas are quite banal. And this is what many of his critics hold against him. The claim that culture is fiction is not an important insight, but is simply a perverse way of stating the obvious fact that culture is a set of shared ideas, and ideas, by their very nature, can't be material objects. It would be fair to say that whenever his facts are broadly correct, they are not new. Because, in addition to stating the obvious, scientists realized that there were a lot of factual errors in Sapiens.
I was immediately struck by, the lack of scientific weight. Anyone, of course, is welcome and free to speculate, but presenting speculation as certainty, an objective certainty, I think is very problematic in many, many ways.
The neuroscientist you just saw published an article entitled The Dangerous Populist Science of Yuval Noah Harari. In it, she explains that Harari sacrifices science to sensationalism, and his work is riddled with errors. Her mission is clear: to fact-check Harari's claims one by one with a scientific eye. She even promises us that she won't nitpick too much. She quotes a biologist who pointed out that some of Harari's assertions cannot be true. Harari's assertion that chimpanzees hunt together and fight shoulder to shoulder against baboons, cheetahs, and enemy chimpanzees cannot be true because cheetahs and chimpanzees don't live in the same parts of Africa. And this is where the video is going to take a left turn. Are these criticisms really valid? Here's the rest of the biologist review fact-checking Harari. Harari is possibly confusing cheetahs with leopards, Tureson says. These details could seem inconsequential, but each is a crumbling block in what Harari falsely presents as an inviolable foundation. If a cursory reading shows this litany of basic errors, I believe a more thorough examination will lead to wholesale repudiations. Okay, so he mistakes cheetahs for leopards. Another passage from Harari bothers the neuroscientist. Most top predators of the planet are majestic creatures. Millions of years of dominion have filled them with self-confidence. Sapiens, by contrast, is more like a banana republic dictator. Having so recently been one of the underdogs of the savannah, we are full of fears and anxieties of our position, which makes us doubly cruel and dangerous. Many historical calamities, from deadly wars to ecological catastrophes, have resulted from this over-hasty jump. And she replies, as an evolutionary biologist, I have to say, this passage set my teeth on edge. What exactly makes for a self-confident lion? A loud roar? A bevy of lionesses? A firm paw shake? Is Harari's conclusion based on field observations or experiments in a laboratory? I get her point, but for someone who promises not to be too nitpicky, it's a bad start. When Harari describes the self-confident animals, he's just using a figure of speech to make his story more vivid. It's just good writing. She then attacks Harari over another line from Sapiens. Many animals, including all ape and monkey species, have vocal languages. But she draws from her own research to explain that it's not true that monkeys have language. The problem is that she chooses to define language as the use of abstract symbols. Harari uses a broader definition, but one that makes sense in the context of a popular book. He uses language as a synonym for vocal communication. So she's very correct to note that scientific accuracy doesn't seem to be Harari's main concern. But does this mean that he's a populist and a fraud? Not necessarily. The choice of words depends on the context in which they are used. Harari is writing a popular book, so he decides to use words in their everyday meaning. When he talks about money, companies, and states, he deliberately calls them fictions, not social constructs. And when a journalist asks him to justify himself, he explains. I would almost always go for the day-to-day word, even if the nuance of the professional word is a bit more accurate. So, if his approach to popular writing is openly stated, why does Harari bother academics and researchers so much? Their real issue is that Harari is an alien in the scientific world. Everything he does is almost the opposite of what his colleagues do. For example, take his subject matter. The history of all of humanity from the beginning of time. This is the exact opposite of the extreme specialization of researchers that's happening these days. As an example, the neuroscientist I mentioned earlier spent 10 years studying marmosets. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's a certain species of monkeys. Since Harari talks about the history of everything since the beginning of time, this creates a whole web of arguments, impossible for any one expert to debunk. To be able to fact-check or even discuss Harari's ideas, you have to be an expert in the whole of history, sociology, anthropology, and biology.
And started questioning the science, especially his evolutionary biology part. You know, his writing is so vast that I don't think a person from a single field can satisfyingly critique the breadth of what he...
His own former thesis advisor points this out. Sapiens leapfrog that by saying, let's ask questions so large that nobody can say, we think this bit's wrong and that bit's wrong. Because what he's doing is just building an extremely big model about an extremely big process. Nobody's an expert on the meaning of everything, or the history of everybody over a long period. His detractors accuse him of not having read deeply enough about all the topics he discusses. But when Harari was an undergraduate, he wrote such a well-researched paper for his medieval history class that it was published in a scientific journal. His professor at the time said the paper was absolutely original and really a breakthrough. So, the man who is accused of not putting forward original ideas was getting published in a scientific journal as an undergraduate, which is really exceptional. He proved that he could succeed by playing the scientist game, but he decided to play the influence game. Harari is the very rare case of a nerd who develops a grand theory of everything all by himself and manages to apply it successfully in the real world. Some people spend their lives studying how society works and lecturing us about it. It's very tempting to ask them, If you're so smart, why don't you use your grand theory to grab power, or influence the population, or get rich? Some of them are offended by the question and carry on with their jargon-filled demonstrations for the rest of their lives. But others decide to take the plunge and apply what they know to become successful. Harari studied the importance of shared fictions. Then he applied what he learned to build an empire of influence. It reminds me of Jim Simmons, a genius mathematician who published incredibly complicated papers, until he thought, well, what if I applied my math to the real world and got stinking rich? Which led him to create one of the most profitable investment funds of all time. As for Harari, he wrote the best-selling historical book of all time. His success confirms his theory on the power of stories and shared myth. In Sapiens, he tells the story of a Native American who dictated a message to the Apollo 11 astronauts to take to the moon. The message was later translated as, "They have come to steal your land." Harari himself acknowledges that the story is a legend in a New Yorker article. "I don't know if it's a true story. It doesn't matter. It's a good story. What matters, it's how you present it to the readers." I think I took care to make sure that at least intelligent readers will understand that it maybe didn't happen. So what's important for him is not the truth of the anecdote itself. It's the way he uses it and the conclusion he draws from it. In the same article, he explains how much he enjoyed including fictional passages in Homo Deus, the sequel to Sapiens. He was inspired by ancient historians who included made-up dialogue in their books to make them more vivid. It's no coincidence either that Harari admits to preferring TV to novels. He's obsessed with the way an idea can spread. And the least we can say is that he was successful in spreading his own. Supporting Harari, there is a company, Sapiens, a team of 12 people with a CEO, a CMO, a Peruvian chef who cooks vegan dishes, and a whole galaxy of products. A graphic novel, children's book, a virtual reality experience. His whole project and his whole message could be summarized by the title of the course he still gives at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, History for the Masses, on writing for a general reader. When you start looking into Harari, you realize he has a story to tell about each and every aspect of his life. At first, he seems like he wants to avoid the limelight at all costs. A teacher without a phone who meditates 2 hours a day. But these details are themselves part of the myth of Harari. He never goes to dinners with more than 8 people. But the only time he broke this rule was to have dinner with Benjamin Netanyahu, who stopped eating meat on Mondays after reading Sapiens. His family says he taught himself to read at age 3. Harari corrects. I think it was more like 4 or 5. He goes on an annual Vipassana silent meditation retreat for at least 10 days. And that's why, in 2016, he heard the results of the US presidential election 5 weeks after everyone else. The stories about Harari are never ending. Harari's book was originally published in Hebrew in 2011, and when he saw that it was selling well in Israel, he decided to have the book translated. The problem was that no international publisher believed in this Israeli teacher who wanted to explain the history of humanity. He was turned down time after time and ended up having to translate Sapiens himself and self-publish it on Amazon. It was so homemade that his Gmail address was on the title page. Obviously, history proved him right, even though he himself admits that none of his ideas are original. I thought, this is so banal. There is absolutely nothing there that is new. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a primatologist. I did zero new research. It was really reading the kind of common knowledge and just presenting it in a new way. The key is in the last sentence. Present well-known ideas in a new way. By doing this, he confirms a fundamental principle in entrepreneurship. Great execution always beats great ideas. A brilliant idea that is never acted on is worth nothing. But a decent idea with outstanding execution can create empires. That's how a small e-commerce site that sells books becomes a world-crushing giant. Harari wrote Sapiens by adapting his notes from the classes he gave at university. Writing for students is a great way to test your storytelling skills, because they'd usually rather be doing just about anything else than sitting in a lecture hall or reading a book. This is a lesson that any YouTuber has also learned the hard way. The competition to grab your attention is merciless, and every second wasted is 1% of lost retention. Harari presents himself as a cryptic researcher, but he works like a copywriter. He doesn't write for himself or his peers. He writes to captivate his reader. His book on archaeology and history is structured like the first movie in a blockbuster franchise. In a movie, movie, the hero encounters an inciting incident that sets him on his quest. In Sapiens, the fate of humanity is forever changed by the agricultural revolution. In the movie, the hero has to deal with life and death issues. In Sapiens, humanity is on the brink of irreversible technological change. There would be fascinating analysis to be made of the whole book, but let's take the first chapter as an example. Look at this passage. He wants to show us that Homo sapiens did not arrive after the extinction of the Neanderthals, but that they actually lived simultaneously on Earth for a while. The way he presents this fact is worthy of the first 30 seconds of a clickbaity YouTube video. For starters, the title of the section is Skeletons in the Closet. It teases a shocking revelation worthy of a Netflix documentary. Quite unusual for a chapter on archaeology. Think about the YouTube videos that promise you the dark truth, the hidden truth, or to expose someone in their titles, only to offer you very banal content. Entire channels are built on it, and it works really well. Harari does the same thing in the first sentence of the paragraph. Homo sapiens has kept hidden an even more disturbing secret. It's easy to see how this makes the text more intriguing. It's based on the human instinct, which, if you want to get fancy, you can call cui bono, who benefits from the crime. Has the secret been hidden? We want to know why and who is doing it. But we can also see why this would upset scientists who would say that Homo sapiens has not hidden anything, and that none of this is a secret since archaeologists have been talking about it for a long time. Harari would say it's their fault if their findings remain secret. They don't know how to communicate. Listen to this sick burn. The result was several distinct species, to each of which scientists have assigned a pompous Latin name. Or take the last paragraph of the section. It's a common fallacy to envision these species as arranged in a straight line of descent, with Ergaster begetting Erectus, Erectus begetting the Neanderthals, and the Neanderthals evolving into us. He's doing two different things here. Firstly, the term fallacy implies that something fishy is going on. We're being kept into the dark about something. Secondly, you probably have this vague idea that humans all evolved into Homo sapiens. So he gets the opportunity to offer you a revelation. This linear model gives the false impression that at any particular moment, only one type of human inhabited the Earth, and that all earlier species were merely older models of ourselves. The truth is that from around 2 million years ago until around 10,000 years ago, the world was home at one and the same time to several human species. This is a famous revelation offered with powerful words: the false impression, the truth. And why not? Today there are many species of foxes, bears and pigs. This is a very effective technique, using an analogy with something the reader is deeply familiar with. Like when I used the analogy of the YouTubers fighting to keep your attention earlier. The Earth of 100 million years ago was marked by at least 6 different species of man. It's our current exclusivity, not that multi-species past, that is peculiar and perhaps incriminating. Here he makes a shocking revelation. It's not the period where there are lots of different human species that's weird. It's a present period. Again, note the emotional language with the word incriminating. As we will shortly see, we sapiens have good reasons to repress the memory of our siblings. The last sentence is again worthy of a messed up true crime documentary and serves to set up the next section, which is entitled The Cost of Thinking. A counterintuitive expression which tells you that something positive, thinking, has a hidden cost. Once again, you want to know more. But I'll stop here. Notice how abstract ideas are made personal. There is a conspiracy by the sapient species to make us forget about the other human species. Worse, you yourself are involved. He says we sapiens, and these other species you've never heard of are suddenly our siblings. By the way, I did the same thing in this video. To trick you into watching a line-by-line breakdown of a history book, I hooked you with a controversy around the Harari figure. Is he a fraud? Is he a genius? Why do people hate him? It's not enough to turn the abstract sapient species into a main character. You also have to have interesting things happen to this main character. And so the whole chapter is built around revelations and their consequences. Sapiens is an insignificant animal, but he has skeletons in the closet. And so, he hid his coexistence with other species. But, at the same time, he was in the middle of the food chain. And so, he had to climb to the top. But, to do this, fire had to be domesticated. And so, fire created a gap between sapiens and the others. But that is not the advantage that enabled sapiens to conquer the world. At each step in the thought process, Harari makes an effort to zoom out and add stakes to his story. If you want someone to listen to you, you have to make it clear that you're talking about something that has broader impact and usefulness. You're not watching this video just to understand the success of Sapiens. You're watching it because Harari can teach you principles of storytelling that can help you in your own projects. The last chapters of Sapiens do the seemingly impossible trick of ending a book about the history of Homo sapiens with a cliffhanger. Will humanity survive the artificial intelligence revolution? This is the opposite of the approach of most historians, which consider that the past is more interesting than the present. And so, at the end of his book, Harari introduces life and death issues that will play out in the next few years. He writes that we like to believe that in the future, people just like us will travel from planet to planet in fast spaceships. We don't like to contemplate the possibility that in the future, beings with emotions and identities like ours will no longer exist, and our place will be taken by alien life forms whose abilities dwarf our own. And these could be transformations so fundamental that they will call the very term human into question. How long do we have? No one really knows. By the way, notice that he's writing this in 2011, so he's way ahead of the curve on the ChatGPT hype. But above all, the sheer ambition of this historical book is insane. Not content to sum up multiple scientific fields in a single book, he has the guts to swing into futuristic predictions. In the final sentences of the book, he compares us to dissatisfied gods and wonders if there is anything more dangerous, dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want. This cliffhanger is precisely what propelled Harari into a position of trusted advisor among the powerful. Since he has framed the problem so eloquently, who better to help save humanity? When you listen to an interview with Harari, there is always a moment when it turns into hippie talk.
I practice Vipassana meditation to see reality more clearly. If I can't observe the reality of my own breath for 10 seconds, how can I hope to observe the reality of the global political system or of the global economic system?
This is another criticism leveled at him by those who call him an imposter. Watch video of Yuval Noah Harari, the author of the widely successful book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, and you will hear him being asked the most astonishing questions. At random, we can find an artist who questions him about artificial intelligence, DNA, and art.
Do you think that artificial intelligence will be part of our DNA, and will it pass on through procreation, and will it replace the natural mutation? And what does it mean for humanity in that case? And what does it mean for art?
Or someone who asks him how to get governments to give up power.
Question here from Phil Dennis. How do we get people, governments to relinquish power?
So it is quite legitimate to ask how a historian who did his thesis on Renaissance military memoirs became the undisputed expert on the future of humanity. But we already know the answer. Harari ended Sapiens with a cliffhanger, so he could give it a sequel. And since Sapiens has already covered the entire history of humanity, at least according to Harari, the sequel obviously cannot go back to that. The next two books abandon history and talk about the future and transhumanism. This is a phenomenon I call the guru expansion theory. Guru expansion theory is a process by which a specialist first gains your trust in their field of expertise and then expands their advice on a galaxy of subjects that have nothing to do with their original field of expertise. Contrary to what we might think, there is nothing new about this. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls it a total intellectual, present on all fronts of thought. Philosopher, critic, novelist, man of the theater. It's an expression that took a negative connotation in the second half of the 20th century to designate intellectuals like Sartre who became references on everything and anything. Today we have Joe Rogan who dives into theories about the origin of COVID, even though he got famous with jokes about drugs and a show about eating testicles. So how does guru expansion work? It starts with being able to explain the current situation very accurately. Take Jordan Peterson, another total intellectual. His greatest strength is being able to take the existential anxieties of men in the 21st century seriously.
When people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively.
And because he knows how to describe the problem, you naturally assume that he has the solution, even though the answers he gives in his book 12 Rules for Life are anything but new. He advises doing what has always worked, like making your bed and standing up straight. So that's how a doctor in clinical psychology who specializes in alcoholism ends up telling us about ChatGPT.
So I'll tell you what ChatGPT is, just so you know, because you need to know this.
Guru expansion. Harari does the same thing. he defines the problems for you. Humanity faces three primary threats: nuclear war, ecological collapse, and technological disruption. Other issues that politicians commonly talk about, terrorism, migration, inequality, poverty, are lesser worries, if not distractions. And so, you naturally turn to him for the solution. Harari manages to tell the story of the past in a captivating way, by combining different disciplines. So we presume that he's the prophetic guide who will know how to lead us into a peaceful and happy future. 527 subscribers, only 473 to go. So if you liked the video, please subscribe. And if you want to learn why Burger King won't stop talking about McDonald's, click here.